think 5 or 6 times in my life that I've taken a puff.
That was then Liberal leader Justin Trudeau back in 2013. An off-the-cuff comment revealed his thoughts on pot a year after his party passed a resolution to legalize cannabis. Trudeau later doubled down and turned it into a key campaign promise.
The Liberal Party is committed to legalizing and regulating marijuana.
Once in power, the government made its announcement on the world stage on a not-so-random date.
We will be introducing legislation in the spring of 2017 that ensures that we keep marijuana out of the hands of children and profits out of the hands of criminals.
But the challenges and concerns were far from over.
This is an artificial date that the government has set. A lot of concerns being raised in the medical community.
That date is now just days away, so is the country ready?
People are a little anxious about how the thing will roll out.
Whatever happens next week, what are the stakes for the government?
So who better to talk about the politics of pot than at issue? Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Shachi Kurl is in Vancouver. Okay, let's start with you, Andrew. This was a big campaign promise, so big that I would say it's probably one of the things he'll be able to point to in the next election and say, I got it done. How much is riding on getting this right for the government?
Well, first of all, they got it done and they kept their promise, so that points over some of the other promises they made. There is going to be inevitably, I think, some confusion and some chaos in the wake of this. If you look at what is in train in the various provinces and the various municipalities, there is widespread confusion. There's all kinds of different approaches. People are in different stages of readiness for this. I suspect, unless it's really serious, most people will understand that we are entering in a completely new age. There are going to be inevitable teething difficulties. There's going to be inevitable transition difficulties that will arise. I don't think they will take too much flack for that. But I do think that's going to depend on one thing, among other things, on how much of an increase in usage do we see coming out of this. There is no doubt that we have erected powerful interests now that have an interest in encouraging people to smoke up, not only in the private sector, but also in the government sector. And I think we're fooling ourselves if we don't think we're normalizing consumption of marijuana, and that's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way.
Okay, but the counter to that, Chantal, would be the government is normalizing marijuana in order to try and keep it out of the hands of kids. That's what their argument is, and to shut down the black market. So if that's the end game, is that not worth that?
I'm not sure that all that many people are buying into the official line, keeping it out of the hands of kids, but I think most people who have had any experience with kids or who have been kids know that it is in the hands of kids at this point, so we're not putting it in the hands of kids. I suspect the fallout for the Liberals, when it counts, which is next year in the election, will be minimal because it will be too early to tell. And part of the genius, quote unquote, of the approach to this has been to allow every province to deal with it in the way it saw fit. And at some point, some provinces are going to find that other provinces have better approaches and vice versa. It's going to take a while. But I'm struck by the fact that, as far as I can tell, no party is planning to campaign in the next election on rolling back the clock on this. Yep. In part, I guess, because a lot of former conservative politicians have become very invested in what Andrew was talking about, which is the setting up of a profitable industry dealing with cannabis.
Well, I did talk to a conservative this week who said there's no room really here for them. They're not going to criticize it. They're not going to. It's happening and on they go. So Shachi, is it a political issue then in any real sense after next week?
It's definitely the risks, I think, and I would beg to differ a little bit, outweigh the rewards for the Liberals on this. The rewards have already largely been collected. They came in the fall of 2015. Hey, I'm going to do this. People showed up. They voted for him. Those younger voters, particularly who were motivated to come out and vote for the Liberals, are they going to do so again, or does he now have to pull another rabbit out of the hat or another promise out? In the meantime, to Andrew's point around that confusion, the confusion can lead to anxiety, and we're already starting to see that. It's funny, all this national anxiety over something that's supposed to mellow us out. But for the most part, Canadians are skeptical as to whether or not it will be kept out of the hands of kids. point taken, it's already in their hands, but it will continue to be in their hands in the minds of many Canadians. They're not necessarily convinced this is going to be an economic boon to Canadian societies and communities. They're not convinced that law enforcement is going to be poised and ready to deal with people driving high. And so when you have all of those small anxieties, they can have a tendency to sort of blow up. And that is where the Conservatives are poised on the law and order file to say, hey, we don't have an issue with legalization, but you've botched the rollout.
Chantal wants back in. Go ahead. Yeah.
One, I think the rollout and the rollout issues will largely come back to haunt provinces and not the federal government, because clearly that is where the action is. Two, I was at the convention that voted for this resolution when the Liberals were in third place. And I was struck by the fact that a lot of the people who voted for that were parents and not the young Liberals. And part of the reason is, yes, there will be anxiety, but it will be balanced by the loss of the anxiety of having your teenager or young adult facing a criminal record for having gotten caught taking a toke on a Saturday night. So bottom line, I have not seen it be an issue in any provincial election. We have a government here incoming that is going to raise the age to 21. That is not even a big issue outside of public health circles, and those circles are saying, do not make that age higher because you're not going to kill the black market. But it's going to take more than the next 9-10 months to the election to see the real fallout from this policy.
Okay, last word to Andrew, and on that point about the time, I mean, we can't expect this to be hunky-dory as of next Wednesday. It will take some time to figure it out and for people to get comfortable with it too.
That's right, and as I say, different provinces and different cities are in different stages of implementation. Right. In Ontario, they're not going to have private stores open for another 6 months, for example. I do think to touch on one issue that Chantal raised briefly, one measure of people's, whether this is a success or not, is the degree to which they're able to push organized crime out of it and eliminate the black market. The C.D. Howe Institute just came out with a study suggesting that demand is likely to outrun supply so much that the black market is in real danger of flourishing rather than being eliminated. So that's something they're going to have to really look for in the next 6 months to a year is, do you actually push crime out of it? You know, we want to keep it out of the hands of kids, but we want to take it out of the hands of organized crime, and I'm not sure we're there yet.
Although again,
there's a lot of skepticism on that.
Yeah, and I was going to say the same. If people who are used to buying it on the black market, they may not make the switch right away, so it may take time to see whether you can measure that within the first year. Okay, I just want to switch gears if I can quickly to get you some thoughts on Stephen Harper's new book. Whether you've read it or not, I just started. He's been out courting the U.S. media and I would say focusing on conservative leaning media largely. Andrew, you've written about it today. I don't know if you've finished reading it. It's not very long. What is your reaction to him? And this is his big sort of foray back into public life in some ways, I guess.
Well, there's some validity to it. I think that to take the positive part first, he's right to say that American conservatives in particular got locked into a very doctrinaire, dogmatic, congealed in 1980 version of conservatism, and they're not really addressing the problems of today. That's fine. I'm not so enamored of his analysis of populism and of Trump supporters. I think what is really the case is he himself, Harper, happens to agree with Trump on a series of issues, on immigration, on trade, on nationalism. But he doesn't want to say that he agrees with Trump, so he says, well, I agree with his supporters, and you conservatives, you should have listened to them. Well, maybe they shouldn't, maybe they shouldn't have, but the reason why Trump has attracted so much support isn't really for his views on trade or these kinds of things. It's because of the culture wars in the United States and the particular representation of people who feel left out by the media, looked down upon by the elites, and that sort of thing. It's not really an economic base at all. So I think it's kind of a self-serving analysis that allows him to defend a lot of the things he did in government, which strayed very far from conservative orthodoxy, as not being unprincipled or expedient or making it up as he went along, but really he was just sort of populist before its time. That's convenient, but not particularly persuasive.
Okay. Chantal.
I have a really hard time equating Stephen Harper, the persona that we saw in office for 10 years, with populism, even good populism. And I have a real hard time with his analysis of society, as in people who can work anywhere and people who are in their communities, and the notion that people who are more mobile, more cosmopolitan, have less attachment to country and values. That is not how debates, for instance, about the future of Quebec have played out, where so-called cosmopolitan and so-called average people who are attached to their communities have connected on an issue and on a dream. So I found it really interesting, more for what it said about Stephen Harper, who remains a bit of an enigma to many of us after all those years, than about what it said about Canadian society.
Okay, 1 minute for you, Sachi, to react to that as well.
So I think what struck me was his commentary just on political discourse. And he says, you know, we need to be less dogmatic. We have to be more empirical. Hey, I'm a data person, so yay, let's all be more empirical. But this is also the person who injected the word crazy repeatedly into conversations about policy, particularly around oil and gas. When we look at the roots of the tweet wars on climate change or on immigration, where you've got leaders on the left and leaders on the right really talking more to their bases than trying to reach across the divide and convince people of the rightness of their way or the way they're proffering, yes, some of that has to do with what's bled from south of the border. Some of that's had to do with what's bled from overseas. But you know what? The roots also go back to the stringent and strident messaging that we heard out of the Harper Conservatives over subsequent mandates and several elections. And you know what? You reap what you sow, and I think we're reaping a little bit of that dogma that we now hear being decried in this book.
Okay, good book reviews, everybody. I'm going to keep reading mine. Thank you. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. This week, we're talking former Governor General Michaël Jean's bid to stay on as the head of the Francophonie without support, government support anyway. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.